John always woke up early. The heat of Phoenix seeped into the small apartment, and the noise from the streets started to filter through the windows. That morning, the sweet smell from the kitchen blended with the warm air. Emily had been up for hours, preparing the sweets she sold every day downtown. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, but her eyes sparkled with determination. "Good morning, John," she said, without looking up from the dough she was stirring vigorously. John, used to this routine, knew what the day would bring. His mom's struggle to sell her sweets, and his own battle at school, surrounded by judgmental stares. He sat at the table and, for a moment, just watched her. Emily was no longer young. Since his father's death, she was all he had. And for him, that was enough. "Today's a big day," she said, interrupting his thoughts. "Your last rehearsal for graduation, right?" John nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He was about to achieve the dream they had shared for years, to graduate and, hopefully, win a scholarship that could change their lives. But something else weighed on John, something he rarely shared. At school, he wasn't just the kid with good grades. He was the kid with worn-out clothes, the one who often didn't have anything to eat during lunch. He knew the other students saw him that way, and it hurt. They didn't know about the late nights his mom spent working, or how she smiled even when she was exhausted. The day went on, and as Emily prepared to leave with her old bike loaded with sweets, John watched her ride off through the window. He knew she'd come back late at night, tired yet still hopeful that all this effort would secure them a better future. A future where she wouldn't have to sell sweets on the streets of Phoenix anymore. At school, John tried to focus on the graduation prep, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time someone teased him about his appearance or his family situation, he held it in. This will all pass, he thought. He just needed to stay focused for a few more months. After that, everything would change. During lunch, he isolated himself in the corner of the courtyard. "I have to do this for her," he whispered to himself. The image of Emily working under the scorching sun pushed him forward. She deserved better, and John promised that, somehow, he would make it happen. With graduation approaching, he was about to fulfill part of that promise. But there was still a long journey ahead. At the end of the day, John came home, and as usual, Emily was already in bed, exhausted. The silence was almost comforting. He looked at the covered plate on the table, prepared by his mom before going to sleep. Even when tired, she never stopped caring for him. John knew the pressure was mounting. With graduation so close, he needed to make sure he didn't let Emily down. But deep down, he was also afraid. Afraid that, despite all their effort, nothing would change. The weight of that responsibility was starting to suffocate him, but he couldn't let his mom see. As the night went on, John lay in bed thinking about everything that was coming. He knew that soon, he would face challenges bigger than just school teasing. And as he stared at the ceiling, he whispered a promise to himself, "I'm going to change our lives." The next morning, John walked into the school feeling the weight of the familiar stares. The muffled laughter and whispers came from every corner. To the other students, he was just the poor kid, and that image followed him like a shadow. He tried to ignore the comments, but as graduation got closer, the pressure seemed to grow. In the main hallway, a group of boys stopped next to John. One of them, Mike, always made it a point to mock him. "Hey, John, have you decided which trash can you're going to wear to graduation?" he said with a malicious grin. The others laughed. John clenched his fists but didn't react. The words still hurt, but he had learned not to respond. He knew any reply would just give them more ammunition. "It doesn't matter," he repeated to himself as he walked through the hallway toward his classroom. He had bigger things to worry about. That morning, his literature teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called John to talk after class. She had always been one of the few who believed in him. "John, graduation is almost here," she said with a serious expression. "You have a great opportunity ahead. Have you sorted everything out about the scholarship?" He nodded. "Yes, I just need to pass the final exams and make sure all the paperwork is ready on time." "You'll make it," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I see the effort you put in, and I'm sure this is just the beginning of something great." John smiled shyly. Her support meant a lot, but it also reminded him that the pressure was real. He couldn't mess up, not after everything his mom had gone through to get him this far. As the school day went on, he could barely concentrate on the lessons. His thoughts were always on Emily and the tireless work she did. While his classmates went out to eat at restaurants, she was pedaling under the hot sun, carrying her basket of sweets, day after day. Every smile she gave him hid the exhaustion of a life full of sacrifices. And John knew that if he failed now, all of it would have been for nothing. At the end of the day, When the bell rang signaling the end of classes, John grabbed his books and walked toward the exit. He passed the same boys who had mocked him earlier, but this time, they didn't say anything. Maybe because they knew that nothing they said now would change the fact that, despite everything, he was almost there. Before leaving the building, he looked back. That school, with all its challenges and pains, was about to be left behind. But the future waiting for him was still uncertain, and John knew that, before crossing the finish line, there would still be obstacles to face. The heat of Phoenix felt even stronger that afternoon when John got home. As he opened the door to the small apartment, the stuffy air wrapped around him, but there was no sign of Emily. He looked around and saw that she still hadn't returned from work. The tiredness on John's face was obvious, both from the long walk and the thoughts that had consumed him all day. He threw his backpack into a corner and sat on the couch, sinking into a quiet restlessness. John knew that Emily was doing her best. He couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could keep up that pace. With each passing day, she seemed more exhausted. Her once strong arms now trembled slightly when carrying the basket of sweets. Every pedal of her old bike seemed to carry the weight of the world on her back. And for John, that was unbearable. He looked at the clock on the wall. The hours dragged on, and he waited anxiously for her to arrive. He knew that when she came in, she would be too tired for any conversation. It's always like this, he thought. John wanted to lighten her load, but the feeling of helplessness only grew. School wasn't helping much, and the pressure to get the best grades weighed more heavily each day. He needed that scholarship. He needed to give his mom something more than what she had. Around 9 o'clock, John heard the key turn in the door. Emily came in, her shoulders slumped, her forehead glistening with sweat. The smile she always wore was there, but her eyes gave away the exhaustion. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, placing the basket of sweets on the floor and sitting heavily in the chair. "How was your day?" "It was fine," John lied, trying to hide his concern. He didn't want her to know how he was feeling. "You're almost there," Emily said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "Graduation is just around the corner. All of this will be worth it." John smiled back, but deep down, his doubts grew. What if it wasn't enough? What if, even with all the effort, things didn't change? These questions haunted him constantly. He couldn't fail, not when his mom's health was on the line. As Emily went off to bed, John stayed in the living room, lost in his thoughts. The responsible ity felt overwhelming, and at that moment, he realized that, no matter how hard he tried, his mother's sacrifice was something he could never fully repay. The days leading up to graduation passed quickly, but for John, time seemed to slow down every time he thought about the future. Each step closer to that big moment brought a new layer of uncertainty and fear. He pushed himself harder with every test, every school assignment, as if his future depended on each grade. And in a way, it did. That week, final exams began, and the pressure reached an unbearable level. In the classroom, the tension among the students was palpable. For most of them, it just meant the end of high school, a rite of passage. But for John, it was much more. He had to secure the scholarship. He had to prove that all of Emily's sacrifices hadn't been in vain. After one of the toughest exams, John felt a tightness in his chest. His classmates left the room chatting about their futures, many excited about the colleges they had already secured. John, on the other hand, just walked out in silence. Every step was a mix of hope and doubt. He walked through the empty halls, feeling the weight on his shoulders. What if his grades weren't good enough? What if, despite all his efforts, the scholarship didn't come through? These questions consumed him, growing inside like a storm. When he got home that night, he found Emily asleep on the couch, still in her work clothes. Her face was peaceful, but the signs of exhaustion were visible. John stood by the door for a few minutes, watching her. She did everything for him, gave everything she had so that he could have a future. And now, all that responsibility fell on his shoulders. He went to the kitchen and opened his books, trying to focus on studying. But the anxiety wouldn't leave him alone. The words on the pages seemed scrambled, and his mind wandered, drifting back and forth to the uncertain future that awaited him. John began to doubt himself. The fear of failing was overwhelming, and he couldn't ignore the inner voice telling him that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't strong enough to change his mother's life. That night, John barely slept. Exhaustion and insecurity tormented him, and for the first time, he questioned whether he could really fulfill the promise he had made to Emily. Finally, graduation day arrived. The Phoenix morning was bright and warm, like so many off-airs, but for John, everything felt different. He put on his cap and gown, looking at himself in the mirror with a mix of nervousness and relief. Years of hard work and sacrifice were culminating in this moment. Despite the constant tension, he knew this was the first step toward the future he wanted for himself and Emily. As he adjusted the collar of his gown, his thoughts turned to his mom. Emily had already left early, as usual, pedaling her bike through the streets of Phoenix, selling sweets. She promised she would be at the ceremony, and John knew that, no matter how tired she was, she would keep that promise. He wished she could take a break that day, but he knew the work was their only source of income, at least until he secured the scholarship and could move forward with his studies. When John arrived at the school, the auditorium was already full of smiling families and Annexia students. He looked around, trying to spot Emily. For a few minutes, he couldn't find her. The auditorium seemed like a maze of unfamiliar faces. The nerves started to rise. She would come, right? He knew how much this graduation meant to both of them. The students began lining up for the start of the ceremony. The principal made the opening speech, talking about the effort and the bright future that awaited everyone. But John barely listened. His heart was racing, and he kept scanning the room for Emily. And then, suddenly, he saw her. She walked in from the side of the auditorium, visibly exhausted, still wearing her work clothes. Her basket of sweets hung from one arm, and her hair was hastily tied back. Emily looked worn out, but her smile, her smile, was pure pride. John felt a wave of emotions wash over him. There was something incredibly painful about seeing her like that, after yet another long day of work, but at the same time, that smile meant everything. She was there. No matter what happened, Emily would always be by his side. That thought gave John the strength he needed. When his name was called, he walked up to the stage, receiving the diploma with trembling hands. The applause filled the auditorium, but his eyes were fixed on Emily. She watched him with tears of joy, and in that moment, John realized that everything he had gone through up to that point culminated right there. It wasn't just about him. It was about her. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every taunt he endured at school, it was all for Emily. As he walked off the stage with the diploma in hand, he felt the weight of the moment. But there was also a new feeling, a kind of release. He had done his part. Now, it was time to move on to the next stage, with the promise that, one day, he would do more than just repay her. He would give his mom the life she deserved, far from the streets of Phoenix. As he headed to join the other graduates, John knew the real challenge was just beginning. But on that day, in that instant, he allowed himself to celebrate the victory that was as much his as it was Emily's. John could hardly believe he had made it. With the diploma in hand and the applause echoing through the auditorium, his heart raced. Emotions were running high. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a shared triumph, a journey of sacrifice that he and Emily had faced together. But the most intense moment was yet to come. As the graduates returned to their seats, the principal took the microphone and announced, "Now, we'll hear a few words from one of our top students in this class, John Wilson." John's world stopped for a moment. He knew he had to speak, but he hadn't prepared for what he would say. He felt a lump in his throat and looked at Emily, sitting in the back, tired but with her eyes locked on him. That smile, that presence. He knew then that his speech couldn't just be about him. He walked to the stage, the applause still filling the room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were carrying the weight of all the years of sacrifice on his shoulders. When he reached the microphone, he paused, took a deep breath, and began. I don't even know where to start," he said, his voice trembling a little. "Today, I'm here, receiving this diploma, but the truth is, this diploma doesn't belong only to me. It belongs to the most important person in my life." John looked at Emily, who now had tears in her eyes. The auditorium was completely silent. "My mom, Emily, is sitting in the back," he continued, pointing to her. "You may not know her, but I'd like everyone to know who she is and what she means to me. My mom is the strongest person I've ever known. She lost my dad when I was just a kid, and since then, she's done the impossible to make sure I had a chance in life." John's eyes filled with tears, but he kept going, feeling the weight of every word. "While many of you could count on your parents to help with expenses, my mom sold sweets on the streets of Phoenix every day, under the scorching sun. It was never easy, and there were days when I thought we wouldn't make it. But my mom never gave up. Even when she was tired, even when the world seemed against us, she kept going. And that's why I kept going too." The auditorium remained silent, with many people visibly moved. John quickly wiped away a tear and continued. "So, this diploma isn't just mine. It's hers. It represents every sacrifice my mom made for me. Every day she woke up before sunrise, Every night she came home exhausted, but always with a smile for me. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, is because of her. John paused, trying to hold back the emotion. I promised myself that one day I would repay everything she did for me. And today, this is the first step. I will keep fighting, keep working hard, because my mom deserves so much more than I could ever give. As he finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. People wiped away tears, moved by the power of the story John had just shared. He looked at Emily, who was now openly crying, and smiled. This wasn't the end of a journey, but the beginning of another. As John stepped off the stage, he felt a new energy inside him. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but with Emily by his side, after the speech, John stepped off the stage as the applause still echoed through the auditorium. The emotions of the night were overwhelming, but there was a sense of calm and certainty growing within him. Everything he and Emily had faced, all the sacrifices, had led to this moment. But John knew this was only the first of many victories. He walked toward his mom, who stood up to meet him. Emily's eyes were red from crying, but her smile was the most genuine he had ever seen. When they embraced, John felt as if all the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. It was the hug of a proud mother, a mother who, even in the face of the greatest hardships, never stopped believing in her son. "I told you, you'd make it," Emily whispered. Her voice choked with emotion. "But you've gone beyond anything I could have ever dreamed." John smiled and wiped away a tear that had fallen down his face. "This is just the beginning, Mom. I promise everything will change now." They stayed there, hugging for a few more moments, not needing to say anything else. There was a new hope in the air, a future that, although still uncertain, now seemed bright and full of possibilities. In the days that followed, as John prepared for the next steps, interviews, college applications, and the anxious wait for the scholarship, he felt a renewed confidence. It was no longer just about escaping the hard life he and Emily led, but about building something truly meaningful. He wanted to give his mother the peace she deserved, and now, more than ever, he believed that was possible. And so, with Emily by his side, John knew that no matter the challenges that lay ahead, they were ready to face them together. I hope you enjoyed this emotional story. If it touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our future stories. Share it with your friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinions and suggestions so we can continue bringing you stories that move and inspire.